Hello, and welcome to the Spiritual Journey Book Club. We can develop our spirituality in different ways, such as meditation and mindfulness. But another wonderful way to explore our spirituality is to read inspiring books written by inspiring authors. The Spiritual Journey Book Club has been created to encourage us to do just that, as each month we discover a new book. The words used in the presentation are the words of the author. This presentation is intended to highlight the spiritual wisdom of each book so as to help you on your spiritual journey. Let's start with a few words about the author. So tonight we are reviewing a book by Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was born on the 11th of May, 1895 in Badanapala, a small town in South India. He and his brother were adopted in their youth by Dr. Annie Besant, then president of the Theosophical Society. Dr. Besant and others proclaimed that Krishnamurti was to be a world teacher whose coming the Theosophists had predicted. To prepare the world for this coming, a worldwide organization called the Order of the Star in the East was formed, and the young Krishnamurti was made its head. However, in 1929, Krishnamurti renounced the role that he was expected to play, dissolved the order with its huge following, and returned all the money and property that had been donated for his work. From then, for nearly 60 years until his death on the 17th of February 1986, he traveled throughout the world talking to large audiences and to individuals about the need for a radical change in humankind. Krishnamurti belonged to no religious organization, sect, or country, nor did he subscribe to any school of political or ideological thought. On the contrary, he maintained that these are the very facts that divide human beings and bring about conflict and war. Krishnamurti left a large body of literature in the form of public talks, writings, discussions with teachers and students, with scientists and religious figures, conversations with individuals, television and radio interviews, and letters. And many of these have been published as books and audio and video recordings. Tonight we focus on Freedom from Known, which has always stood out as an exception to the other books by Krishnamurti. Firstly, because he himself suggested it to Mary Loytons, a professional author, even giving her the title. But when she asked what kind of book it should be, he replied, "I leave it to you." So she decided to begin by listing the main topics covered in his talks in the years 1963 to 1967. Mary Loyton's compilation is certainly the most readable exploratory primer, the finest collection of nuggets, as it were, that we have. But how much is something that was born of the turbulent anti-establishment 60s relevant to the world of today? Is Krishnamurti out of date? There is also a strong case for saying that his views are even more relevant now, in the early 21st century, than ever before. We live in a time of growing human interdependence, whether it be the economy, financial markets, politics, pandemics, or climate change. The world we live in clearly calls for a new kind of planetary mentality if it is to avoid new and worse strife. And this is where Krishnamurti becomes very relevant. Because for him, the mind that is capable of producing harmony between nations is inseparable from the mind that brings about harmony between two human beings. To put it succinctly, what is on my plate in psychological terms is also what is on the plate of our planet as a whole. Man has throughout the ages been seeking something beyond himself, beyond material welfare, something we call truth, or God, or reality, a timeless state, something that cannot be disturbed by circumstances, by thought, or by human corruption. And not finding this nameless thing of 1,000 names which he has always sought, he has cultivated faith. Faith in a saviour or an ideal, and faith invariably breeds violence. In this constant battle which we call living, we try to set a code of conduct according to the society in which we are brought up. For centuries we have been spoon-fed by our teachers, by our authorities, by our books, our saints, and we are satisfied with their descriptions. We are second-hand people. We have lived on what we have been told. There is nothing new in us, nothing that we have discovered for ourselves, nothing original, pristine, or clear. We have been assured by religious leaders that if we perform certain rituals, repeat certain prayers or mantras, limit our appetites, and refrain from sexual indulgence, we shall, after sufficient torture of the mind and body, find something beyond this little life. But a tortured mind, a broken mind, a mind which wants to escape from all turmoil, which has denied the outer world and been made dull through discipline and conformity, however long it seeks, will only find according to its own distortion. So to discover whether there actually is or is not something beyond this anxious existence, it seems to me that one must have a completely different approach altogether. The traditional approach is from the periphery inwards, and through time, practice, and renunciation gradually come upon that inner flower, that inner beauty and love. Peel off little by little. Take time. Tomorrow will do. Next life will do. And when at last one comes to the center, one finds there is nothing there, because one's mind has been made incapable, dull, and insensitive. The primary cause of disorder in ourselves is the seeking of reality promised by another. It is a most extraordinary thing that although most of us are opposed to political tyranny and dictatorship, we inwardly accept the authority, the tyranny. So if we completely reject, not intellectually, but actually, all so-called spiritual authority, all ceremonies, rituals, and dogmas, it means we stand alone and are already in conflict with society. We cease to be respectable human beings. You have now started by denying something absolutely false, the traditional approach. But if you deny it as a reaction, you will have created another pattern in which you will be trapped. If you deny it, however, because you understand the stupidity and immaturity of it, if you reject it with a tremendous intelligence, because you are free and not frightened, you will create a great disturbance in yourself and around you, but you will step out of the trap of respectability. Then you will find you are no longer seeking. That is the first thing to learn, not to seek. When you seek, you are really only window shopping. Nobody or nothing can answer the question but you yourself, and that is why you must know yourself. Immaturity lies only in total ignorance of self. To understand yourself is the beginning of wisdom. And what is yourself, the individual you? I think there is a difference between the human being and the individual. The individual is the little, conditioned, miserable, frustrated entity, satisfied with his little gods and his traditions, whereas a human being is concerned with the total welfare, the total misery and total confusion of the world. The outward social structure is the result of the inward psychological structure of our human relationships. For the individual is the result of the total experience, knowledge, and conduct of man. The individual is the human who is all mankind. This field, this life, is all we know. And being unable to understand the enormous battle of existence, we are naturally afraid of it and find escape from it in all sorts of subtle ways. And we are frightened also of the unknown, frightened of death, frightened of what lies beyond tomorrow. So we are afraid of the known and afraid of the unknown. As human beings living in this monstrously ugly world, let us ask ourselves, can this society based on competition, brutality, and fear come to an end? It can only happen, I think, if each one of us recognizes the central fact that we, as individuals, are totally responsible for the whole state of the world. We are each of us responsible for every war because of the aggressiveness of our own lives, because of our nationalism, our selfishness, our gods, our prejudices, our ideals, all of which divide us. And only when we realize, not intellectually, but actually as we would recognize that we are hungry or in pain, that you and I are responsible for this existing chaos, only then will we act. But what can you and I do to create a completely different society? We have been told that all paths lead to truth, which is, when you look at it, so obviously absurd. Truth has no path, and that is the beauty of truth. It is living. When you see that truth is something living, moving, which nobody can lead you to, then you will see that this living thing is what you actually are. Your anger, your brutality, your violence, your despair, the agony and sorrow you live in. And you understand it only if you know how to look at those things in your life. There is no guide, no teacher, no authority. There is only you. Your relationship with others and with the world, there is nothing else. When you realize this, it either brings great despair, or in facing the fact that you and nobody else are responsible for the world and for yourself, for what you think, what you feel, how you act, all self-pity goes. Can you and I bring about in ourselves, without any outside influence, can we bring about in the very essence of our being a total revolution, a psychological mutation, so that we are no longer brutal, violent, competitive, anxious, fearful, greedy, envious, and all the rest of the manifestations of our nature which have built up the rotten society in which we live our daily lives? What is important is not a philosophy of life, but to observe what is actually taking place in our daily life, inwardly and outwardly. When we look at what is taking place in the world, we begin to understand that there is no outer and inner process. There is only one unitary process. It is a whole, total movement, the inner movement expressing itself as the outer, and the outer reacting again on the inner. To be able to look at this seems to me all that is needed, because if we know how to look, then the whole thing becomes very clear. And to look needs no philosophy, no teacher. If you try to study yourself according to another, you will always remain a second-hand human being. Nobody tells you how to look. You just look. When you reject something false which you have been carrying about with you for generations, then when you throw off a burden of any kind, you have more energy, you have more capacity, more drive, greater intensity and vitality. If you do not feel this, then you have not thrown off the burden. But when you have thrown it off and have this energy in which there is no fear at all, then is not that energy itself the mutation? We need a tremendous amount of energy and we dissipate it through fear. But when there is this energy which comes from throwing off every form of fear, that energy itself produces the radical inward revolution. You do not have to do a thing about it. You are free to discover, and when there is freedom, there is energy. You are free, and from that center you act, and hence there is no fear. And a mind that has no fear is capable of great love. And when there is love, it can do what it will. To understand ourselves needs no authority either of yesterday or of 1,000 years, because we are living things, always moving, flowing, never resting. To be free of all authority of your own and that of another is to die to everything of yesterday, so that your mind is always fresh, always young, innocent, full of vigor and passion. It is only in that state that one learns and observes. And for this, a great deal of awareness is required. Actual awareness of what is going on inside yourself, without correcting it or telling it what it should or should not be. Now we are going to investigate ourselves together. Forget all you know about yourself. Forget all you have ever thought about yourself. We are going to start as if we knew nothing. Let us start our journey together with all the remembrance of yesterday left behind, and begin to understand ourselves for the first time. You have to be your own teacher and your own disciple. You have to question everything that man has accepted as valuable, as necessary. Face the fact. Look at it. Do not run away from it. The moment you run away, fear begins. In inquiring into ourselves, we are not being in the least neurotic, because there is no difference between the individual and the collective. I have created the world as I am. Now, where do we begin to understand ourselves? I can observe myself only in relationship, because all life is relationship. I cannot exist by myself. I exist only in relationship to people, things, and ideas. And in studying my relationship to outward things and people as well as to inward things, I begin to understand myself. I have to study myself in actuality, as I am, not as I wish to be. Learning about yourself is always in the present, and knowledge is in the past. But if you are learning all the time, learning every minute, learning by watching and listening, learning by seeing and doing, then you will find that learning is a constant movement without the past. It is a total movement. To understand anything, you must live with it. You must observe it. You must know all its contents, its nature, its structure, its movement. In order to observe the movement of your own mind and heart, of your whole being, you must have a free mind, not a mind that agrees and disagrees, taking sides in an argument, disputing over mere words, but rather following with an intention to understand. Each of us has an image of what we think we are or what we should be, and that image entirely prevents us from seeing ourselves as we actually are. It is one of the most difficult things in the world to look at anything simply. the simplicity that can look directly at things without fear, that can look at ourselves as we actually are without any distortion. Also, in order to understand ourselves, we need a great deal of humility. The moment you have a conclusion or start examining from knowledge, you are finished. For then you are translating every living thing in terms of the old. Whereas if you have no foothold, if there is no certainty, no achievement, there is freedom to look, to achieve. For centuries we have been conditioned by nationality, class, tradition, religion, language, education, literature, the food we eat, the climate we live in, our family, our friends, our experiences. Every influence you can think of. And therefore our responses to every problem are conditioned. You respond to every challenge according to your conditioning, and your conditioning, being inadequate, will always react inadequately. You will be able to see for yourself how you are conditioned only. When there is a disturbance, when your wife looks at someone else, or you lose your money, or are threatened with war or any other pain of anxiety, then you know you are conditioned. And what shall we do? Get used to it as one gets used to living with a backache? There is a tendency in all of us to put up with things, to get used to them, to blame them on circumstances. If one gets used to disturbance, it means that one's mind has become dull, just as one can get so used to beauty around one that one no longer notices it. If we do not get used to it, we try to escape from it by taking some kind of drug, finding some other form of amusement. Why is it that we escape from actual facts? We are afraid of death, and we invent all kinds of theories, hopes, beliefs to disguise the fact of death. But the fact is still there. Most of us are afraid of living as well as dying. Now, why cannot we face that fact? You can face a fact only in the present. And if you never allow it to be present because you are always escaping from it, you can never face it. And because we have cultivated a whole network of escapes, we are caught in the habit of escape. The moment you give your total attention to your conditioning, you will see that you are free from the past completely, that it falls away from you naturally. When you become aware of your conditioning, you will understand the whole of your consciousness. Consciousness is the total field in which thought functions and relationships exist. All motives, intentions, desires, pleasures, fears, inspirations, longings, hopes, sorrows, joys are in that field. But we have come to divide this consciousness into active and the dormant, the upper and the lower levels. That is all the daily thoughts, feelings, and activities on the surface, and below them the so-called subconscious, which expresses themselves occasionally through certain intimations, intuitions, and dreams. We are occupied with one little corner of consciousness, which is most of our life. The rest, which we call the subconscious, with all its motives, its fears, its racial and inherited qualities, we do not even know how to get into. Now I'm asking you, is there such a thing as the subconscious at all? It seems to me that it is as trivial and as stupid as the conscious mind, as narrow, bigoted, conditioned, anxious, and tawdry. So is it possible to be totally aware of the whole field of consciousness and not merely a part of it, a fragment of it? This is important to understand, because when you are being totally aware of the whole field of consciousness, there is no friction. We live in fragments, one thing at the office, another at home. Are you aware of this fragmentary existence in yourself? When you admit time into the process of understanding yourself, you must allow for every form of distortion because the self is a complex entity. So you will discover for yourself that this is not the way. You will understand that the only way to look at yourself is totally, immediately, without time. When you look totally, you will give your whole attention. You will attend with complete self-abandonment, and then there is no room for fear, no room for contradiction, and therefore no conflict. Attention is not the same thing as concentration. Concentration is exclusion. Attention, which is total awareness, excludes nothing. If you want to understand the beauty of a bird, a fly, or a leaf, or a person with all his complexities, you have to give your whole attention, which is awareness. And you can give your whole attention only when you give your whole heart and mind. Such a state of attention is total energy. In such awareness, the totality of yourself is revealed in an instant. When you have looked at yourself so deeply, you can go much deeper. We are always measuring, comparing. If I am all the time measuring myself against you, struggling to be like you, then I am denying what I am myself. When I understand that comparison in any form leads only to greater illusion and greater misery, when I understand that all such processes lead only to greater conformity and therefore greater conflict, then my mind is no longer seeking. This does not mean that my mind is satisfied with things as they are, but such a mind has no illusion. Such a mind can then move in a totally different dimension in which there is no conflict, no sense of otherness. What will open the door is daily awareness and attention. Awareness of how we speak, what we say, how we talk, what we think. And that mind can be understood only by yourself, by watching it and never trying to shape it, never taking sides, never opposing, never agreeing, never justifying, never condemning, never judging, which means watching it without any choice. And out of this choiceless awareness, perhaps the door will open and you will know what that dimension is in which there is no conflict and no time. We are all engaged in the pursuit of pleasure in some form or another, intellectual, sensuous, or cultural pleasure. And the ultimate pleasure is, of course, to have God. Pleasure is the structure of society. From childhood until death, we are secretly, cunningly, or obviously pursuing pleasure. So whatever our form of pleasure is, I think we should be very clear about it, because it is going to guide and shape our lives. You may ask, why then should life not be guided by pleasure? For the very simple reason that pleasure must bring pain, frustration, sorrow, and fear. And out of fear, violence. If you want to be free from sorrow, you must understand the whole structure of pleasure. A mind that is all the time seeking pleasure must inevitably find its shadow, pain. They cannot be separated. Pleasure comes into being through 4 stages: perception, sensation, contact, and desire. I see a lovely cloud, or a mountain clear against the sky, or a glorious sunset, or a beautiful face. I look at these things with intense delight, and as I observe them, there is no observer, but only sheer beauty like love. I can look at it with joy, and the next moment forget it. Or else the mind steps in, and then the problems begin. My mind thinks over what it has seen and thinks how beautiful it was. thought begins to compare, judge. Thought wants to repeat the experience. The more you think about it, the more strength thought gives to pleasure. So thought creates and sustains pleasure through desire and gives it continuity. And therefore, the natural reaction of desire to any beautiful thing is perverted by thought. Thought turns it into a memory, and memory is then nourished by thinking about it over and over again. Have you ever noticed that when you respond to something totally with all your heart, there is very little memory? It is only when you do not respond to a challenge with your whole being that there is conflict, a struggle. And this brings confusion and pleasure or pain. And the struggle breeds memory. Anything that is the result of memory is old and therefore never free. So if you can look at things without allowing pleasure to creep in, if you can look at it without wanting the experience to be repeated, then there will be no pain, no fear, and therefore tremendous joy. So if you understand that where there is a search for pleasure, there must be pain. If you want to end pleasure, though, which is to end pain, you must be totally attentive to the whole structure, meaning and significance of pleasure. Joy is an immediate thing, and by thinking about it, you turn it into pleasure. Living in the present is the instant perception of beauty and the great delight in it, without seeking pleasure from it. Then you will have tremendous joy. One is fundamentally interested in oneself, and for various ideological or traditional reasons, one thinks it is wrong. But what one thinks is irrelevant. What is a fact is that one is fundamentally and lastingly interested in oneself. You may say it is more satisfactory to help another than to think about yourself. If it gives you greater satisfaction to help others, you are concerned about what will give you greater satisfaction. Satisfaction in all sorts of ways, subtle and obvious, is what we want. When we say we want freedom, we want it because we think it may be wonderfully satisfying. And the ultimate satisfaction, of course, is this peculiar idea of self-realization. What we are really seeking is a satisfaction in which there is no dissatisfaction at all. Most of us crave the satisfaction of having a position in society because we are afraid of being nobody. Everyone in the world wants a position, whether in society, in the family, or to sit on the right hand of God. And this position must be recognized by others, otherwise it is no position at all. This craving for position, for prestige, for power, to be recognized by society as being outstanding in some way, is a wish to dominate others. And this wish to dominate is a form of aggression. And fear is one of the greatest problems in life. We are afraid about something. There is no fear in abstraction. It is always in relation to something. Do you know your own particular fears? And what do you usually do about them? You run away from them, don't you? Or invent ideas and image to cover them. But to run away from fear is only to increase it. One of the major causes of fear is that we do not want to face ourselves as we are. The first thing to ask ourselves then is, what is fear and how does it arise? The movement from certainty to uncertainty is what I call fear. The actual moment, as I am sitting here, I am not afraid. I am not afraid in the present. Nothing is happening to me. Nobody is threatening me or taking anything away from me. But beyond the actual moment, there is a deeper layer in the mind which is consciously or unconsciously thinking of what might happen in the future, or worrying that something from the past may overtake me. So I am afraid of the past and the future. Now, take your particular form of fear. Watch your reactions to it. Can you look at it without any movement of escape, justification, condemnation, or suppression? Can you look at death, for instance, without the word, which arouses the fear of death? Is the word death causing you fear, or the actual ending? If it is the word or the memory which is causing you fear, then it is not fear at all, but the experience which has remained in the mind as memory rouses the thought. So thought engenders one kind of fear. Is fear the result of thought? If it is, thought being always old, fear is always old. So what we are afraid of is the repetition of the old, the thought of what has been, projecting into the future. Therefore, our question now is it possible for the mind to live completely, totally in the present? It is only such a mind that has no fear. But to understand this, you have to understand the structure of thought, memory, and time. Thought, like memory, is of course necessary for daily living. It is the only instrument we have for communication, working at our jobs, and so forth. So thought is essential at certain levels. But when thought projects itself psychologically as the future and the past, creating fear as well as pleasure, the mind is made dull, and therefore inaction is inevitable. Consciously, you can be aware of your fears, but at the deeper levels of your mind, are you aware of them? You cannot understand yourself according to Freud or Jung or according to me. Other people's theories have no importance whatever. It is of yourself that you must ask the question. Is there only fear which you translate into different forms? When you understand that fear is a single movement which expresses itself in different ways, and when you see the movement and not the object to which the movement goes, then you are facing an immense question. How can you look at it without the fragmentation which the mind has cultivated? You can watch only when the mind is very quiet, just as you can listen to what someone is saying only when your mind is not chattering with itself, carrying on a dialogue with itself about its own problems and anxieties. To live with a living thing, such as fear, requires a mind and a heart that are extraordinarily subtle, that have no conclusion, and can therefore follow every movement of fear. If you live with it so completely, you inevitably ask, who is the entity who is living with fear? Who is it who is observing fear, watching all the movements of the various forms of fear, as well as being aware of the central fact of fear? Are you, the observer, a dead entity watching a living thing? Or are you a living thing watching a living thing? Because in the observer, the two states exist. So the observer is separate from that thing he calls fear. There is space between them. As you watch, you learn that the observer is merely a bundle of ideas and memories without any validity or substance, but that fear is an actuality and that you are trying to understand a fact with an abstraction, which, of course, you cannot do. When you see that you are part of fear, not separate from it, that you are fear, then you cannot do anything about it. Then fear comes totally to an end. Most of us take pleasure in violence, in disliking somebody, having antagonistic feelings towards others. But in a state of mind in which all violence has come to an end, there is a joy which is very different from the pleasure of violence with its conflicts, hatreds, and fears. Let us consider whether it is at all possible totally to end every form of violence in ourselves and still live in this monstrously brutal world. If we know how to look at violence, not only outwardly in society, but also in ourselves, then perhaps we shall be able to go beyond it. We are trying to understand violence as a fact, not as an idea, as a fact which exists in the human being. To go into the problem, I must be completely vulnerable, open to it. But I must be in a state of mind that demands to see this thing right to the end, and at no point stop and say I will go no further. Violence is not merely killing another. It is a violence when we use a sharp word, when we make a gesture to brush away a person, when we obey because there is fear, when you separate yourself by belief, by nationality, by tradition. It breeds violence. So a man who is seeking to understand violence does not belong to any country, to any religion, to any political party or partial system. He is concerned with the total understanding of mankind. And one of the most common expressions of violence is anger. When my wife or sister is attacked, I say I am righteously angry. When my country is attacked, my ideas, my principles, my way of life, I am righteously angry. I am also angry when my habits are attacked or my petty little opinions. The moment you protect your family, your country, a bit of coloured rag called a flag, a belief, an idea, a dogma, the thing that you demand or that you hold, that very protection indicates anger. Can you look at anger completely objectively, which means neither defending it nor condemning it? To be free from violence means everything to me. It is more important to me than sex, food, position. For this thing is corrupting me. It is destroying me and destroying the world. And I want to be beyond it. But to be beyond violence, I cannot suppress it. I cannot deny it. I have to look at it. I have to study it. I must become very intimate with it. And I cannot become intimate with it if I condemn it, justify it. I feel responsible for all this anger and violence in the world. Now, if you want to stop violence, if you want to stop wars, how much vitality, how much of yourself do you give to it? Don't you see that this violence in yourself is destroying your children? Or do you see it only as some abstraction? You have to learn that you condemn and justify because it is part of the social structure you live in. Your conditioning as a German or an Indian or a Negro or an American or whatever you happen to have been born, with all the dulling of the mind that this conditioning results in. If you have a blunt instrument, a dull instrument, you cannot go deeply. So what we are doing is sharpening the instrument, which is the mind that has been made dull by all this justifying and condemning. You have to want it as you want your next meal. And to have it, you must see that what makes your mind dull and stupid is this sense of invulnerability, which has built walls around itself and which is part of this condemnation and justification. I am asking whether it is possible for a human being living psychologically in any society to clear violence from himself inwardly. If it is, the very process will produce a different way of living in this world. I do not think anything is going to be achieved through analysis, either by ourselves or by a professional. But I must analyze, which means that in the process of analysis, my mind becomes extraordinarily sharp. And it is that quality of sharpness, of attention, of seriousness, which will give total perception. If you want to understand the actual, you must give your whole attention, all your energy to it. The man who is really serious, with the urge to find out what truth is, what love is, has no concept at all. He lives only in what is. To live completely, fully, in the moment is to live what is, the actual, without any sense of condemnation or justification. Then you understand it so totally that you are finished with it. When you see clearly, the problem is solved. There is no trying, no doing your best. Either you do it or you don't do it. You are admitting time while the house is burning. When the house is on fire, do you argue about the color of the man who brings water? The cessation of violence, which we have just been considering, does not necessarily mean a state of mind which is at peace with itself, and therefore at peace in all its relationships. In all our relationships, each one of us builds an image about the other, and these two images have relationship, not the human beings themselves. Relationship based on these images can obviously never bring about peace in the relationship, because the images are fictitious, and one cannot live in an abstraction. And yet that is what we are doing, living in ideas, in theories, in symbols, in images which we have created about ourselves and others, and which are not realities at all. All our relationships are based essentially on this image forming, and hence there is always conflict. In all our relationships, whether with the most intimate person, or whether with a neighbor, or with society, this conflict exists. Observing ourselves and our relationships to society, we see that at all levels of our being there is conflict, minor or major conflict, which brings about very superficial responses or devastating results. When we examine our own minds and hearts, the way we think, the way we feel, and how we act in our daily lives, we observe that as long as we conform to the pattern of society, life must be a battlefield. If we do not accept it, then we will be completely free from the psychological structure of society. Most of us are rich with the things of society, what society has created in us, and what we have created in ourselves. Our greed, envy, anger, hate, jealousy, anxiety. And with all these we are very rich. Poverty is to be completely free of society. One must become poor inwardly, for then there is no seeking, no asking, no desire, no nothing. It is only this inward poverty that can see the truth of a life in which there is no conflict at all. Such a life is a benediction not to be found in any church or any temple. By taking some form of drug, we may find enough energy temporarily to see things very clearly, but we revert to our former state and therefore become dependent on that drug more and more. So all stimulation, whether of the church or of alcohol or of drugs or of the written or spoken word, will inevitably bring about dependence. And that dependence prevents us from seeing clearly for ourselves and therefore from having vital energy. I discover for myself that I depend on something, an audience, say, which will stimulate me. I derive from that audience, from addressing a large group of people, a kind of energy. And therefore I depend on that audience, on those people, whether they agree or disagree. The more they disagree, the more vitality they give me. If they agree, it becomes a very shallow, empty thing. So I discover that I need an audience because it is a very stimulating thing to address people. Now why? Why do I depend? Because in myself I am shallow. In myself I have nothing. In myself, I have no source which is always full and rich, vital, moving, living. So I depend. I have discovered the cause. The discovery of the cause is merely intellectual, so obviously it does not free the mind from its dependency. What frees the mind from dependence is seeing the whole structure and nature of stimulation and dependence, and how that dependence makes the mind stupid, dull, and inactive. Seeing the totality of it alone frees the mind. We are always comparing what we are with what we should be. Contradiction exists when there is comparison, not only with something or somebody, but with what you were yesterday, and hence there is conflict between what has been and what is. There is what is only when there is no comparison at all, and to live with what is to be peaceful. When you do not compare at all, when you no longer struggle to be different from what you are, your mind has ceased to create the opposite and has become highly intelligent, highly sensitive, capable of immense passion. If you do not compare yourself with another, you will be what you are. The very nature of desire, if not properly understood, must inevitably lead to conflict. Desire is always in contradiction. In ourselves, we are in a state of contradiction, and that state of contradiction is brought about by desire. Desire being the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So we see desire as the root of all contradiction, wanting something and not wanting it, a dual activity. There is, of course, duality in nature, man and woman, light and shade, night and day. But inwardly, psychologically, why do we have duality? We have been conditioned in what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, what is moral and what is immoral. Do we use the opposite as a lever to get rid of what is, or is it an escape from the actual? You have a concept of what you should be and how you should act, and all the time you are in fact acting quite differently. So you see that principles, beliefs, and ideals must inevitably lead to hypocrisy and a dishonest life. It is the ideal that creates the opposite to what is. So if you know how to be with what is, then the opposite is not necessary. Trying to become like somebody else or like your ideal is one of the main causes of contradiction, confusion, and conflict. A mind that is confused, whatever it does at any level, will remain confused. Any action born of confusion leads to further confusion. So what happens? I cease to act in terms of confusion anymore. Therefore, inaction is complete action. And when we talk of freedom, are we talking about complete freedom, or a freedom from some inconvenient or unpleasant or undesirable thing? So it is for each of us to decide whether or not we want to be completely free. If we say we do, then we must understand the nature and structure of freedom. Is it freedom when you are free from something? Free from pain, free from some kind of anxiety? If you say you are free from something, it is another form of reaction, which will then become another reaction, which will bring about another conformity, another form of domination. But it is not freedom. It is merely a continuity of a modified past which the mind clings to. Freedom comes only when you see and act, never through revolt. Freedom is a state of mind, not freedom from something, but a sense of freedom. A freedom to doubt and question everything, and therefore so intense, active, and vigorous that it throws away every form of dependence, slavery, conformity, and acceptance. Such freedom implies being completely alone. This solitude is an inward state of mind which is not dependent on any stimulus or any knowledge, and is not the result of any experience or conclusion. There is a difference between isolation, cutting oneself off, and aloneness, solitude. You are never alone because you are full of all the memories, all the conditioning, all the mutterings of yesterday. Your mind is never clear of all the rubbish it has accumulated. To be alone, you must die to the past. The mind that is alone is not only innocent, but young. Not in time or age, but young, innocent, alive at whatever age. And only such a mind can see that which is truth and that which is not measurable by words. In this solitude, you will begin to understand the necessity of living with yourself as you are, not as you think you should be or as you have been. See if you can look at yourself without any tremor, any false modesty, any fear, any justification or condemnation. Just live with yourself as you actually are. Is freedom to be achieved through a gradual process? Obviously not, because as soon as you introduce time, you are enslaving yourself more and more. You cannot become free gradually. It is not a matter of time. Freedom can only come about naturally, not through wishing, wanting, longing. To come upon it, the mind has to learn to look at life, which is a vast movement, without the bondage of time, for freedom lies beyond the field of consciousness. I am tempted to repeat a story about a great disciple going to God and demanding to be taught truth. This poor God says, "My friend, it is such a hot day. Please get me a glass of water." So the disciple goes out and knocks on the door of the first house he comes to, and a beautiful young lady opens the door. The disciple falls in love with her, and they marry and have several children. Then one day it begins to rain, and keeps on raining, raining, raining. The torrents are swollen, the streets are full, the houses are being washed away. The disciple holds on to his wife and carries his children on his shoulders. And as he is being swept away, he calls out, "Lord, please save me." And the Lord says, "Where is that glass of water I asked for?" Man lives by time. Inventing the future has been his favorite game of escape. But time doesn't bring order or peace. So we must stop thinking in terms of gradualness. When there is a real danger, time disappears, doesn't it? There is immediate action. Time is a movement which man has divided into past, present, and future. And as long as he divides it, he will always be in conflict. Problems exist only in time. And the problem continues so long as we continue to give it incomplete attention, so long as we hope to solve it one of these days. Do you know what time is? It is the interval between idea and action. An idea is for self-protection, obviously. It is the idea of being secure. Action is always immediate. It is not of the past or of the future. To act must always be in the present, but action is so dangerous, so uncertain, that we conform to an idea which we hope will give us a certain safety. There is the idea, the interval, and action, and in that interval is the whole field of time. That interval is essentially thought. Thought through observation, through desire, and the continuity of that desire sustained by further thought says, "Tomorrow I shall be happy. Tomorrow I shall have success. Tomorrow the world will be a beautiful place. So thought creates that interval, which is time. So long as there is this interval of time which is being bred by thought, there must be sorrow. There must be continuity of fear. Now take the question of death, which is an immense problem to most people. Is it possible to meet it so completely that you do not make a problem of it at all? In order to meet it in such a way, all belief, all hope, all fear about it must come to an end. Otherwise, you are meeting this extraordinary thing with a conclusion, an image, with a premeditated anxiety, and therefore you are meeting it with time. Time is the interval between the observer and the observed. That is, the observer, you, is afraid to meet this thing called death. You don't know what it means. You have all kinds of hopes and theories about it. You believe in reincarnation or resurrection, or in something called the soul, the Atman, a spiritual entity which is timeless and which you call by different names. If thought can think about it, it is within the field of thought, and therefore it cannot be permanent, because there is nothing permanent within the field of thought. To discover that nothing is permanent is of tremendous importance, for only then is the mind free. Then you can look, and in that there is great joy. We have separated living from dying, and the interval between the living and the dying is fear. That interval, that time, is created by fear. Living is our daily torture, daily insult, sorrow, and confusion, with occasional opening of a window over enchanted seas. That is what we call living, and we are afraid to die, which is to end this misery. We would rather cling to the known than to face the unknown. To live completely wholly every day as if it were a new loveliness, there must be dying to everything of yesterday. Otherwise you live mechanically, and a mechanical mind can never know what love is or what freedom is. The man who is not frightened of life is not frightened of being completely insecure, for he understands that inwardly, psychologically, there is no security. When there is no security, there is endless movement, and then life and death are the same. To die is to have a mind that is completely empty of itself, empty of its daily longings, pleasures, and agonies. Death is a renewal, mutation, in which thought does not function at all because it is old. When there is death, there is something totally new. Freedom from the known is death, and then you are living. Most of us want the security of loving and being loved. But is there love when each one of us is seeking his own security, his own particular path? This seeking for security is inviting insecurity. We are not loved because we don't know how to love. What is love? Is love an idea? Love may be the ultimate solution of all man's difficulties. So how are we going to find out what love is? By merely defining it? The church has defined it in one way, society in another, and there are all sorts of deviations and perversions. In what they call human love, they see there is pleasure, competition, jealousy, the desire to possess, to hold, to control, and to interfere with another's thinking. And knowing the complexity of all this, they say there must be another kind of love, divine, beautiful, untouched, uncorrupted. So to go into the question of what love is, we must first free it from the encrustation of centuries, put away all ideas and ideologies of what it should or should not be. When one loves, there must be freedom, not only from the other person, but from oneself. This belonging to another, being psychologically nourished by another, depending on another, in all this there must always be anxiety, fear, jealousy, guilt, and so long as there is fear, there is no love. A mind ridden with sorrow will never know what love is. Sentimentality and emotionalism have nothing whatsoever to do with love, and so love is not to do with pleasure and desire. Love is always active, present. It is not I will love or I have loved. If you know love, you will not follow anybody. Love does not obey. When you love, there is neither respect nor disrespect. Don't you know what it means really to love somebody? To love without hate, without jealousy, without anger, without wanting to interfere with what he is doing or thinking, without condemning, without comparing. When you totally abandon yourself to that love, there is not the other. So when you ask what love is, you may be too frightened to see the answer. It may mean complete upheaval. It may break up the family. You may discover that you do not love your wife or husband or children. Do you? You may have to shatter the house you have built. You may never go back to the temple. But if you still want to find out, you will see that fear is not love. Dependence is not love. Jealousy is not love. Possessiveness and domination are not love. Responsibility and duty are not love. Self-pity is not love. The agony of not being loved is not love. Love is not the opposite of hate, any more than humility is the opposite of vanity. So if you can eliminate all these, not by forcing them, but by washing them away as the rain washes the dust of many days from a leaf, then perhaps you will come upon this strange flower which man always hungers after. There is beauty only when your heart and mind know what love is. But when there is love and beauty, whatever you do is right. Whatever you do is in order. It seems to me that one thing is absolutely necessary, and that is passion without motive. Passion that is not the result of some commitment or attachment. Passion that is not lust. Love can come into being only when there is total self-abandonment. Love is something that is new, fresh, alive. It has no yesterday and no tomorrow. It is beyond the turmoil of thought. It is only the innocent mind which knows what love is, and the innocent mind can live in the world which is not innocent. To go beyond thought and time, which means going beyond sorrow, is to be aware that there is a different dimension called love. But you don't know how to come to this extraordinary font. So what do? Absolutely nothing. Then inwardly you are completely silent. Do you understand what that means? It means that you are not seeking, not wanting, not pursuing. There is no center at all. Then there is love. We have been inquiring into the nature of love and have come to a point, I think, which needs much greater penetration, a much greater awareness of the issue. When I say love has no tomorrow and no yesterday, or when there is no center when there is love, it has reality for me, but not for you. You may quote it and make it into a formula, but that has no validity. You will have to see it for yourself. But to do so, there must be freedom to look, freedom from all condemnation, all judgment, all agreeing, all disagreeing. If your eyes are blinded with your worries, you cannot see the beauty of the sunset. Most of us have lost touch with nature. Civilization is tending more and more towards large cities. We are becoming more and more an urban people, living in crowded apartments and having very little space even to look at the sky of an evening and morning, and therefore we are losing touch with a great deal of beauty. Having lost touch with nature, we naturally tend to develop intellectual capacities. We read a great many books, go to a great many museums and concerts, watch television, and have many other entertainments. We quote endlessly from other people's ideas and think and talk a great deal about art. If you are directly in contact with nature, if you watch the movement of a bird on the wing, see the beauty of every movement of the sky, watch the shadows on the hills or the beauty on the face of another, do you think you will want to go to any museum to look at any picture? Perhaps it is because you do not know how to look at all the things about you that you resort to some form of drug to stimulate to see better. Seems to me that one of our greatest difficulties is to see for ourselves really clearly, not only outward things, but inward life. When we say we see a tree or a flower or a person, do we actually see them? Have you ever experimented with looking at an objective thing like a tree without any of the associations, any of the knowledge you have acquired about it, seeing it as it actually is? Try to see it and see what is actually takes place when you observe the tree with all your being, with the totality of your energy. In that intensity, you will find that there is no observer at all. There is only attention. When you are looking at something with great attention, there is no space for a conception, a formula, or a memory. It is only a mind that looks at a tree or the stars or the sparkling waters of a river with complete self-abandonment that knows what beauty is. And when we are actually seeing, we are in a state of love. Beauty lies in the total abandonment of the observer and the observed, and there can be self-abandonment only when there is total austerity. The austerity of being totally simple, which is complete humility. Say you are surrounded by nature and there is no dog barking, no noise of a car passing, or even the flutter of a bird. You are completely silent and nature around you is also wholly silent. In that state of silence, both in the observer and the observed, when the observer is not translating what he observes into thought, in that silence there is a different quality of peace. There is neither nature nor the observer. There is a state of mind wholly, completely alone. It is alone, not in isolation, alone in stillness, and that stillness is beauty. It is only when we see without any preconception, any image, that we are able to be in direct contact with anything in life. All our relationships are really imaginary. That is based on an image formed by thought. If you have an image about you and you have an image about me, naturally we don't see each other at all as we actually are. Only when we understand the true relationship between each other is there a possibility of love. And love is denied when we have images. These images create the space between you and what you observe. And in that space there is conflict. So what we are going to find out now together is whether it is possible to be free of the space we create, not only outside ourselves, but in ourselves. The space which divides people in all their relationships. Now, the very attention you give to a problem is the energy that solves the problem. When you give your complete attention, I mean with everything in you, there is no observer at all. There is only the state of attention, which is total energy. And that total energy is the highest form of intelligence. Naturally, that state of mind must be completely silent. And the silence, that stillness, comes when there is total attention. That total silence in which there is neither the observer nor the thing observed is the highest form of religious mind. Every problem is related to every other problem, so that if you can solve one problem completely, it does not matter what it is, you will see that you are able to meet all other problems easily and resolve them. We are talking, of course, of psychological problems. Not only must we be aware of the nature and structure of the problem and see it completely, but meet it as it arises and resolve it immediately, so that it does not take root in the mind. If one allows a problem to endure for a month or a day or even for a few minutes, it distorts the mind. These memories are the images we carry about with us. Life is very real. Life is not an abstraction. And when you meet it with images, there are problems. Is it possible to meet every issue without this space-time interval? Without the gap between oneself and the thing of which one is afraid? So long as there is a center creating space around itself, there is neither love nor beauty. When there is no center and no circumference, then there is love. And when you love, you are beauty. You cannot cultivate love and beauty, nor can you invent truth. But if you are all the time aware of what you are doing, you can cultivate awareness. And out of that awareness, you will begin to see the nature of pleasure, desire, and sorrow, and the utter loneliness and boredom of man. And then you will begin to come upon that thing called the space. When there is space between you and the object you are observing, you will know there is no love. And without love, however hard you try to reform the world or bring about a new social order, or however much you talk about improvements, you will only create agony. So it is up to you. There is no leader, there is no teacher, there is nobody to tell you what to do. You are alone in this mad, brutal world. When I build an image about you or about anything, I am able to watch that image. So there is the image and the observer of the image. But the observer is aware of more than one image. He creates thousands of images. But is the observer different from these images? Isn't he just another image? He's always adding to and subtracting from what he is. He is a living thing, all the time weighing, comparing, judging, modifying, and changing as a result of pressures from outside and within. Living in the field of consciousness, which is his own knowledge, influence, and innumerable calculations. When you look at the observer, who is yourself, you see that he is made up of memories, experiences, accidents, influences, traditions, and infinite varieties of suffering, all of which are the past. So the observer is both the past and the present, and tomorrow is waiting, and that is also a part of him. In that state of mind, which is within the field of time, you, the observer, look at fear, at jealousy, at war, at the family, and try to solve the problem of the thing observed, which is the challenge, the new. You are always translating the new in terms of the old, and therefore you are everlastingly in conflict. Awareness of all this, which is real meditation, has revealed that there is a central image put together by all the other images, and this central image, the observer, is the censor, the experiencer, the evaluator, the judge who wants to conquer or subjugate the other images or destroy them altogether. The other images are the result of judgments, opinions, and conclusions by the observer, and the observer is the result of all the other images. Therefore, the observer is the observed. So awareness has revealed the different states of one's mind. This awareness that the observer is the observed is not a process of identification with the observed. We are considering something entirely different. We must understand it not verbally, but in our core, right at the root of our being. In ancient China, before an artist began to paint anything, a tree for instance, he would sit down in front of it for days, months, years. It didn't matter how long, until he was the tree. He did not identify himself with the tree, but he was the tree. No space between the observer and the observed. He was totally the tree, and in that state only could he paint. When the observer realizes that the thing about which he is acting is himself, then there is no conflict between himself and the image. He is that. All reaction that is the outcome of reaction to like and dislike has come to an end. Then you will find that there is an awareness that has become tremendously alive. And from that intensity of awareness, there is a different quality of attention. And therefore the mind, because the mind is this awareness, has become extraordinarily sensitive and highly intelligent. So let us go now into the question of what is thinking. The significance of that thought, which must be exercised with care, logic, and sanity for our daily work, and that which has no significance at all. Unless we know the two kinds, we cannot possibly understand something much deeper, which thought cannot touch. Why has thought become so important in our lives? If thought doesn't give continuity to feeling, feeling dies very quickly. So why, in our daily lives, in our grinding, boring, frightened lives, has thought taken on such inordinate importance? Why is one a slave to thought? Thought which has enjoyed the pleasure of yesterday, and given that pleasure continuity in the present, and also in the future. Thought which is always active, chattering, moving, constructing, taking away, adding, supposing. Ideas have become far more important to us than action. We are forever discussing ideas and ideals and offering opinions. We have separated ideas from action because ideas are always of the past and action is always present. That is, living is always the present. We are afraid of living, and therefore the past, as ideas, has become so important to us. We have seen how thought sustains and gives continuity to a pleasure that we had yesterday, and how thought also sustains the reverse of pleasure, which is fear and pain. So the experiencer, who is the thinker, is the pleasure and the pain, and also the entity who gives nourishment to the pleasure and pain. The thinker separates pleasure from pain. He doesn't see that in the very demand for pleasure, he is inviting pain and fear. Thought in human relationships is always demanding pleasure, which it covers by different words like loyalty, helping, giving, sustaining, serving. What is it all about? Does a flower full of beauty, light, and loveliness say, I am giving, helping, serving? It is. And because it is not trying to do anything, it covers the earth. Thought is the breeder of duality in all our relationships. There is violence in us which gives us pleasure, but there is also the desire for peace, the desire to be kind and gentle. Thought not only breeds this duality in us, this contradiction, but it also accumulates the innumerable memories we have had of pleasure and pain. And from these memories, it is reborn. So thought is the past. Thought is always old, as I have already said. As every challenge is met in terms of the past, a challenge being always new, Our meeting of the challenge will always be totally inadequate. Hence contradiction, conflict, and all the misery and sorrow we are heir to. Our little brain is in conflict whatever it does. Those who think a great deal are very materialistic because thought is matter. Thought is matter as much as the floor, the wall, the telephone are matter. Energy functioning in a pattern becomes matter. That is all life is. Matter and energy are interrelated. The one cannot exist without the other. And the more harmony there is between the two, the more balance, the more active the brain cells are. A new fact cannot be seen by thought. It can be understood later by thought, verbally, but the understanding of a new fact is not reality to thought. Thought can never solve any psychological problem. The old brain cannot solve the enormous problem of living. Thought is crooked because it can invent anything and see things that are not there. But if you understand the whole structure of how you think, why you think, the words you use, the way you behave in your daily life, the way you talk to people, the way you treat people, the way you walk, the way you eat, if you are aware of all these things, then your mind will not deceive you. Then there is nothing to be deceived. The mind then is not something that demands, that subjugates. It becomes extraordinarily quiet, pliable, sensitive, alone, and in that state there is no deception whatsoever. Have you ever noticed that when you are in a state of complete attention, the observer, the thinker, the center, the me, comes to an end? In that state of attention, thought begins to wither away. If one wants to see a thing very clearly, one's mind must be very quiet, without all the prejudices, the chattering, the dialogue, the images, the pictures. All that must be put aside to look. And it is only in silence that you can observe the beginning of thought, that you will begin to see out of that silence how thought takes shape. If there is awareness of how thought begins, then there is no need to control thought. If there is an awareness of the beginning of thought, then there is no contradiction in thought. As long as there is no thought derived from memory, experience, or knowledge, which are all of the past, there is no thinker at all. You will see, if you have gone this far in the journey, that you will respond to a challenge, not with the old brain, but totally anew. In the life we generally lead, there is very little solitude. Even when we are alone, our lives are crowded by so many influences, so much knowledge, so many memories of so many experiences, so much anxiety, misery, and conflict, that our minds become duller and duller. There's rather a nice story of two monks walking from one village to another, and they come upon a young girl sitting on the bank of a river, crying. And one of the monks goes up to her and says, "Sister, what are you crying about?" She says, "You see that house over there across the river? I came over this morning early and had no trouble wading across, but now the river has swollen and I can't get back. There is no boat." "Oh," says the monk, "that is no problem at all." And he picks her up and carries her across the river and leaves her on the other side. And the two monks go on together. After a couple of hours, the other monk says, "Brother, we have taken a vow never to touch a woman. What you have done is a terrible sin. Didn't you have pleasure, a great sensation in touching a woman?" And the other monk replies, "I left her behind 2 hours ago. You are still carrying her, aren't you?" That is what we do. We carry our burdens all the time. It is only when we give complete attention to a problem and solve it immediately, never carrying it over to the next day, the next minute, that there is solitude. Then, even if we live in a crowded house or in a bus, we have solitude. And that solitude indicates a fresh mind, an innocent mind. To have inward solitude and space is very important because it implies freedom to be, to go, to function, to fly. One can see directly that it is only when the mind is silent that there is a possibility of clarity. The whole purpose of meditation in the East is to bring about such a state of mind. That is, to control thought. But unless one lays the foundation, which is to be free from fear, free from sorrow, anxiety, and all the traps one lays for oneself, I do not see how it is possible for a mind to be actually quiet. This is one of the most difficult things to communicate. Communication between us implies, doesn't it, that not only must you understand the words I am using, that we must both, you and I, be intense at the same time, not a moment later or a moment sooner, and capable of meeting each other on the same level. And such communication is not possible when you are interpreting what you are reading according to your own knowledge, pleasure, or opinions, or when you are making a tremendous effort to comprehend. It seems to me that one of the greatest stumbling blocks in life is this constant struggle to reach, to achieve, and to acquire. We are trained from childhood to acquire and achieve in order to have physical security. But psychological security is not within the field of achievement. We demand security in all our relationships, attitudes, and activities. But as we have seen, there is actually no such thing as security. It is essential, of course, to have outward security, shelter, clothing, food. But that outward security is destroyed by the demand for psychological security. Space and silence are necessary to go beyond the limitations of consciousness. But how can a mind which is so endlessly active in its self-interest be quiet? One can discipline it, control it, shape it, but such torture does not make the mind quiet. It merely makes it dull. Most of our lives are outwardly disciplined by the demands of society, by the family, by our own suffering, by our own experiences. And that form of discipline is the most deadening thing. Discipline must be without control, without suppression, without any form of fear. It is not discipline first and then freedom. Freedom is at the very beginning, not at the end. To understand this freedom, which is the freedom from the conformity of discipline, is discipline itself. The very action of learning is discipline. The very act of learning becomes clarity. To understand the whole nature and structure of control, suppression, and indulgence demands attention. And to study it, there must be freedom from condemnation, justification, opinion, or acceptance. We are negating all those things that are considered important to bring about the quietness of the mind. The only silence we know is the silence when noise stops, the silence when thought stops. But that is not silence. Silence is something entirely different, like beauty, like love. You are waiting for me to describe what this silence is, so that you can compare it, interpret it, carry it away and bury it. It cannot be described. What can be described is the known, and the freedom from the known can come into being only when there is a dying every day to the known, to the hurts, the flatteries, to all the images you have made, to all your experiences. The silence, which is not the silence of the ending of noise, is only a small beginning. It is like going through a small hole into an enormous, wide, expansive ocean, to an immeasurable, timeless state. A living mind is a still mind. A living mind is a mind that has no center, and therefore no space and time. Such a mind is limitless, and that is only the truth. That is the only reality. We all want experiences of some kind: the mystical experience, the religious experience, the sexual experience, the experience of having a great deal of money, power, position, domination. And as we grow older, we may have finished with the demands of our physical appetites, but then we demand wider, deeper, and more significant experiences, and we try various means to obtain them, expanding our consciousness, for instance, which is quite an art, or taking various kinds of drugs. This demand for more and more experiences shows the inward poverty of man. We think that through experiences we can escape from ourselves, but these experiences are conditioned by what we are. If the mind is petty, jealous, anxious, it may take the very latest form of drug, but it will see only its own creation, its own little projections from its own conditioned background. So behind this demand for experience is the desire for satisfaction, and the demand for satisfaction dictates the experience. And therefore we have not only to understand this whole business of satisfaction, but also the thing that is experienced. To have some great satisfaction is a great pleasure. So pleasure dictates the form of experience we demand, and pleasure is the measure by which we measure the experience. Anything measurable is within the limits of thought and is apt to create illusion. You can have marvelous experiences and yet be completely deluded. So you have to question not only the experience of another, but your own experience. We cannot recognize a new experience. It is impossible. We recognize only something we have already known, and therefore when we say we have had a new experience, it is not new at all. So we have discovered a fundamental truth, which is that a mind that is seeking, craving for wider and deeper experience is a very shallow and dull mind, because it lives always with its memories. We depend on experiences, on challenges to keep us awake. But in fact, this dependence only makes our minds duller. To keep awake totally without any challenge or any experience implies a great sensitivity, both physical and psychological. It means I have to be free of all demands. For the moment I demand, I will experience. Demand is born out of duality. I am unhappy and I must be happy. In that very demand that I must be happy is unhappiness. Everything affirmed contains its opposite, and effort to overcome strengthens that against which it strives. So one must be free of this incessant demand, otherwise there will be no end to the corridor of duality. This means knowing yourself so completely that the mind is no longer seeking. Such a mind does not demand experience. It is completely what it is. Is it possible then to live in this world without the more, without this everlasting comparison? Surely it is. But one has to find out for oneself. Investigation into this whole question is meditation. There are different schools of meditation, different methods and systems. There are systems which say, watch the movement of your big toe, watch it, watch it, watch it. There are other systems which advocate sitting in a certain posture, breathing regularly, or practicing awareness. All this is utterly mechanical. Another method gives you a certain word and tells you that if you go on repeating it, you will have some extraordinary transcendental experience. This is sheer nonsense. It is a form of self-hypnosis. By repeating Amen or Om or Coca-Cola indefinitely, you will obviously have a certain experience because by repetition, the mind becomes quiet. Meditation is not following any system. It is not constant repetition and imitation. Meditation is not concentration. You should be attentive to every movement of the mind wherever it wanders. Meditation demands an astonishingly alert mind. Meditation is the understanding of the totality of life in which every form of fragmentation has ceased. Meditation is not control of thought, for when thought is controlled, it breeds conflict in the mind. Meditation is to be aware of every thought and of every feeling, never to say it is right or wrong, but just to watch it and move with it. Meditation is a state of mind which looks at everything with complete attention and not just parts of it. No one can teach you how to be attentive. Meditation is one of the greatest arts in life, perhaps the greatest, and one cannot possibly learn it from anybody. That is the beauty of it. It has no technique and therefore no authority. When you learn about yourself, watch yourself. Watch the way you walk, how you eat, what you say, the gossip, the hate, the jealousy. If you are aware of all of that in yourself without any choice, that is part of meditation. So meditation can take place when you are sitting in a bus, or walking in the woods full of light and shadows, or listening to the singing of birds, or looking at the face of your wife or child. In the understanding of meditation, there is love. Love is not the product of systems, of habits, of following a method. Love cannot be cultivated by thought. To observe in such a way is the discipline, and that kind of discipline is fluid, free, not the discipline of conformity. What we have been concerned with all through this book is the bringing about in ourselves and therefore in our lives of a total revolution that has nothing whatsoever to do with the structure of society as it is. What we need is something totally new. The old brain cannot possibly solve the human problem of relationship. Is it possible for a human being living an ordinary, everyday life in this brutal, violent, ruthless world, a world which is becoming more and more efficient and therefore more and more ruthless, is it possible for him to bring about a revolution, not only in his outward relationships, but in the whole field of thinking, feeling, acting, and reacting? You may say, I can't do anything about it, or how can I influence the world? I think you can tremendously influence the world if in yourself you are not violent. If you lead actually every day a peaceful life, a life which is not competitive, ambitious, envious, small fires can become a blaze. We have reduced the world to its present state of chaos by our self-centered activity, by our prejudices, our hatreds, our nationalism, and when we say we cannot do anything about it, we are accepting disorder in ourselves as inevitable. Any movement which is worthwhile, any action which has deep significance must begin with each one of us. I must change first. I must see what is the nature and structure of my relationship with the world, and in the very seeing is the doing. Therefore, I, as a human being living in the world, bring about a different quality. And that quality, it seems to me, is the quality of the religious mind. The religious mind is something entirely different from the mind that believes in religion. The religious mind is a state of mind in which there is no fear, and therefore no belief whatsoever, but only what is, what actually is. In the religious mind, there is that state of silence we have already examined, which is not produced by thought, but is the outcome of awareness, which is meditation when the meditator is entirely absent. In that silence, there is a state of energy in which there is no conflict. If that energy is allowed to flow without any contradiction, without any friction, without any conflict, then that energy is boundless, endless. When there is no friction, there are no frontiers to energy. It is friction which gives energy limitations. So having once seen this, why is it that the human beings always bring friction into energy? We need energy not only to bring about a total revolution in ourselves, but also in order to investigate, to look, to act. And as long as there is friction of any kind in any of our relationships, there is a waste of energy. As long as there is a time interval between the observer and the observed, it creates friction, and therefore there is a waste of energy. That energy is gathered to its highest point when the observer is the observed, in which there is not time interval at all. Then there will be energy without motive, and it will find its own channel of action, because then the I does not exist. We need a tremendous amount of energy to understand the confusion in which we live. But finding out, searching, implies time. And as we have seen, gradually to uncondition the mind is not the way. Time is not the way. Is it possible to break through this heavy conditioning of centuries immediately and not enter into another conditioning? To be free so that the mind can be altogether new, sensitive, alive, aware, intense, capable? That is the only question we have to ask ourselves. But we do not ask. We want to be told. What I say has very little value. You will forget it the moment you shut this book. Or you will remember and repeat certain phrases. Or you will compare what you have read here with some other book. But you will not face your own life. And that is all that matters. Your life, yourself, your pettiness, your shallowness, your brutality, your violence, your greed, your ambition, your daily agony and endless sorrow. That is what you have to understand. And nobody on earth or in heaven is going to save you from it but yourself. You cannot find the truth without passion. Passion with a fury behind it. Passion in which there is no hidden want. Passion is a rather frightening thing, because if you have passion, you don't know where it will take you. So is fear perhaps the reason why you have not got the energy of that passion to find out for yourself why this quality of love is missing in you? Why there is not this flame in your heart? A man who knows what it is to have humility is a vain man. A man who knows that he is silent, who knows that he loves, does not know what love is or what silence is. If you are passionate in your discovery to find why you haven't got it, you will know it is there. Through complete negation alone, which is the highest form of passion, that thing which is love comes into being. Like humility, you cannot cultivate love. Humility comes into being when there is a total ending of conceit. Then you will never know what it is to be humble. In the same way, when you give your mind and your heart, your nerves, your eyes, your whole being to find out the way of life, to see what actually is and go beyond it, and deny completely, totally the life you live now, in that very denial of the ugly, the brutal, the other comes into being, and you will never know it either. And with that, conclude the presentation on Jiddu Krishnamurti's book, Freedom from the Known. But before I leave you, I'd like to introduce you to the next book in the book club, which is The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield. First published in 1993, it is an adventure novel by James Redfield that discusses various psychological and spiritual ideas rooted in multiple ancient Eastern traditions and New Age spirituality. The main character undertakes a journey in Peru to find and understand a series of 9 spiritual insights written in an ancient manuscript. After struggling to find a publisher who was willing to publish the book straight away, Redfield published it himself, filling the boot of his car with copies to distribute in bookshops, meeting readers and talking about the book. After that, word of mouth recommendations took care of everything else. It sold not because of any publicity, but because others began to give it to their friends everywhere. In 1995 and 1996, The Celestine Prophecy was the best-selling book in the world. It spent 3 years on the New York Times bestseller list, appeared on the Sunday Times list, and featured on numerous other lists throughout the world. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time.